The small, picturesque town of Avonridge sat nestled between rolling hills and dense woods, a place where everyone knew each other, and crime was almost unheard of. The peace of this idyllic community was shattered on a crisp autumn morning when 18-year-old Emily Hopper failed to return home from her routine jog. Emily was a bright and lively teenager, well-liked by her peers and adored by her family. Her disappearance was so unlike her that alarm bells rang almost immediately. That morning had begun like any other. Emily's mother, Laura, recalled watching her daughter tie her sneakers and sling a water bottle over her shoulder before heading out. She'd taken the same trail dozens of times before, a well-worn path that cut through the forest at the edge of town. It was popular among joggers and hikers, known for its scenic views and tranquil atmosphere. When hours passed with no sign of Emily, her parents called her phone repeatedly, only to be met with silence. Panic set in and they called the police. Officers arrived swiftly, treating the case with urgency. Emily's absence didn't fit the pattern of a typical runaway, and the town rallied to help find her. Flyers were printed, announcements were made, and a search party was organized that very afternoon. The search party brought together a mix of friends, neighbors, and strangers, all united by a common purpose. Among them was Lucas Miller, a familiar face around town. Known for his handyman skills and friendly demeanor, Lucas had a reputation for being reliable and community-oriented. He quickly took charge, helping to divide the volunteers into smaller groups and offering advice on how to search the uneven terrain effectively. The woods, which had always seemed so inviting, now felt ominous. Volunteers called Emily's name, their voices echoing through the trees. They scoured the area for hours, finding nothing but broken branches and scattered leaves. As night fell, the search was called off temporarily, though officers continued patrolling the trails. Detectives Sarah Grant and Alex Carter were assigned to the case. Both were seasoned investigators, but cases involving young women were always the hardest. They started by speaking to Emily's family, piecing together the events leading up to her disappearance. Laura described Emily as cautious and routine-driven. Her father, James, mentioned no recent conflicts or changes in her behavior. As the detectives broadened their inquiry, they discovered that Emily had mentioned feeling uneasy during her recent runs. A classmate recalled her saying she thought someone might have been following her, but Emily had brushed it off as paranoia. These details, though seemingly small, painted a troubling picture. Meanwhile, the community's search efforts continued. Volunteers combed through the forest day after day, and Lucas remained one of the most dedicated participants. He often stayed late, sometimes even after others had left, determined to find any trace of Emily. His commitment earned him the admiration of the group, but it also meant he was deeply involved in every step of the search. As days passed with no leads, tension grew. Whispers of fear and speculation spread through Avonridge. People wondered if a stranger had come through town, or worse, if someone they knew was responsible. What no one suspected was that the truth was hiding among them, walking beside them in the search party. The discovery of Emily Hopper's shattered smartphone in the dense forest was the first real break in the case. The phone, its screen fractured but still partially functional, had been buried beneath a layer of damp leaves. A sharp-eyed volunteer stumbled upon it during the second week of the search, and within hours, it was in the hands of forensic specialists. What they uncovered sent a chill through everyone involved in the investigation. Emily's phone contained a video, hastily recorded just moments before her disappearance. The shaky footage showed her running, her breath heavy and her voice panicked. While the visual was mostly blurred, the audio was clear enough to hear her say, "Someone's following me." The video ended abruptly, leaving detectives and volunteers alike to grapple with the terror Emily must have felt. Detectives Sarah Grant and Alex Carter focused their efforts on unraveling the clues the phone provided. The device's GPS data revealed that Emily had veered off her usual jogging route that day. Her path ended in a secluded part of the forest, far from the main trail. The reasons for this sudden detour remained a mystery. Equally puzzling were the cryptic text messages found on the phone. In the days leading up to her disappearance, Emily had exchanged several messages with an unknown number. The tone of her messages hinted at fear, but they stopped short of identifying the source of her unease. Phrases like "I think they know" and "I feel like I'm being watched" painted a troubling picture. The detectives traced the number to a burner phone, making it impossible to identify its owner. As the investigation progressed, the search party continued their efforts, combing through the forest with grim determination. Lucas Miller remained a prominent figure, tirelessly organizing groups and offering words of encouragement. He was often seen chatting with detectives, asking detailed questions about the case and offering suggestions for new search strategies. His involvement earned him respect among the volunteers, but it also drew the quiet attention of Detective Grant. Grant had begun compiling profiles of everyone involved in the search. While most were well-meaning townsfolk with no significant history, Lucas's overly eager participation stood out. He had no criminal record, and his alibi for the day Emily disappeared seemed solid, but Grant couldn't ignore the faint feeling that something was off. Meanwhile, the detectives turned their attention to the messages Emily had sent to her closest friends. One friend mentioned that Emily had recently talked about an older man she often saw on the trail. She had described him as polite but overly friendly, sometimes asking too many personal questions. However, Emily had never indicated that she felt seriously threatened. The new leads created a sense of unease within the community. As whispers of suspicion grew louder, the line between helper and potential suspect blurred. Everyone who had joined the search party began to feel the weight of scrutiny. Despite the mounting tension, Lucas continued to play the role of a concerned citizen, his tireless efforts painting him as a hero to summon a mystery to others. Behind the scenes, Detective Grant kept her suspicions quiet, knowing that the person responsible for Emily's disappearance could be much closer than anyone imagined. The forest held its secrets tightly, but persistence paid off when the search party made a chilling discovery deep within the woods. Beneath a decaying tree stump, they found a shallow grave. The faint, earthy smell of disturbed soil and the grim sight of a human hand protruding from the dirt left no doubt it was Emily Harper. Her lifeless body showed clear signs of a struggle, and the once hopeful search for her had transformed into a murder investigation. The scene was immediately cordoned off, and forensic teams arrived to meticulously examine the area. They uncovered fragments of a torn rope and faint impressions in the soil, likely left by boots. These details hinted at the killer's methodical approach and suggested that the person responsible had chosen this site deliberately, a spot far enough from the main trails to avoid accidental discovery. Emily's family and the town of Haven Ridge were devastated by the news. What had begun as a hopeful search for a missing girl had spiraled into a grim realization that a killer was among them. The focus of the investigation shifted entirely, and the search party's efforts were redirected to finding evidence that might lead to the person responsible. Detectives Sarah Grant and Alex Carter studied the gravesite closely. The rope fibers matched those found near Emily's broken phone, and the boot prints suggested a larger shoe size. These clues, while helpful, were far from conclusive. What stood out to the detectives was the soil itself. The composition was unusual, containing traces of a rare mineral only found in specific areas of the forest. This gave them a critical lead. The killer must have known the woods intimately to select such a precise location. The detectives turned their attention to the members of the search party, compiling detailed profiles on everyone involved. While many volunteers had joined out of genuine concern, others began to raise quiet suspicions. Lucas Miller, who had been one of the most dedicated searchers, was among those under scrutiny. He had been present when Emily's body was found, his reaction seemingly one of shock and sorrow. Yet something about his behavior struck Detective Grant as odd. Lucas's alibi was revisited, and small inconsistencies began to emerge. He had claimed to be with a group during key moments of the search, but when questioned individually, several volunteers couldn't confirm his presence. Additionally, his tendency to guide search efforts away from certain areas raised eyebrows. He seemed to know too much about where not to look, a detail that didn't escape the detective's notice. Further analysis of the gravesite uncovered faint traces of DNA on the rope fragments, but they were too degraded for immediate identification. However, the presence of these fibers tied directly to the grave gave the detectives another angle to pursue. They began comparing the materials to those found in the homes of potential suspects. The search party continued their efforts, but the atmosphere had changed. Suspicion hung heavy in the air, and every participant began to look at each other differently. The idea that the killer could be among them was a chilling thought. Meanwhile, Lucas continued to present himself as the steadfast volunteer, but his over-involvement no longer seemed entirely altruistic. Detective Grant couldn't shake the feeling that Lucas was hiding something, and she quietly began to keep a closer eye on him. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to align, but the full picture remained out of reach. All the while, the killer watched the investigation unfold, confident that their role in the tragedy would remain hidden. For now. Detective Sarah Grant had always trusted her instincts, and as the investigation into Emily Harper's murder deepened, her suspicions about Lucas Miller only grew. While he maintained the image of a concerned volunteer, his behavior didn't sit right with her. He was always the first to suggest search strategies and seemed to position himself as the unofficial leader of the group. It was commendable on the surface, but Grant couldn't help but feel there was more to his involvement. One day, as the search party combed through yet another stretch of forest, Grant decided to observe Lucas more closely. She noticed how he subtly steered the group away from certain areas, often suggesting they focus on spots that were far less likely to yield evidence. His reasons always seemed plausible: too rocky, too dense, or already searched, but his insistence on avoiding specific locations felt calculated. Grant began tracking Lucas's movements during each search. She noted that he had an uncanny ability to suggest areas that would later be found completely devoid of clues. On the rare occasion something was discovered, like Emily's broken phone, Lucas's reaction was intense, almost as if he were performing for the crowd of volunteers. The detectives brought in police dogs to assist with the search, and the results were both promising and unsettling. The dogs picked up a trail that led to the edge of town, ending near Lucas Miller's workshop. It was an old, cluttered building where Lucas repaired tools and crafted furniture for the townsfolk. At first glance, it seemed harmless, but Grant knew they needed to search the premises. Obtaining a warrant, the detectives entered Lucas's workshop under the pretense of following the dog's lead. Inside, they found tools, sawdust, and all the usual trappings of a handyman's workspace. However, in a locked chest tucked away in a corner, they uncovered a shocking piece of evidence: a collection of personal items belonging to Emily. The chest contained a bracelet her mother had described in detail, a set of earbuds matching those she was known to use, and a water bottle identical to the one she carried on her runs. The items were carefully arranged, almost as if they were trophies. Nearby, the detectives found a coil of rope that matched the fragments discovered near Emily's shallow grave. Confronted with these findings, Lucas maintained his calm exterior, claiming he had come across the items during the search and had planned to turn them in but forgot. It was an explanation that might have held up if not for the damning discovery of his boots, which matched the impressions left near Emily's grave. The investigators dug deeper into Lucas's background. While his public persona was squeaky clean, a darker pattern began to emerge. Witnesses came forward, recalling how Lucas had always seemed to know more than he should about the case, often asking probing questions about the investigation's progress. Others admitted they had felt uneasy around him during the searches but dismissed it as stress. As evidence mounted, Lucas's once respected role in the community began to crumble. The detectives now believed that Lucas had not only been involved in Emily's murder but had also inserted himself into the search to control the narrative and deflect suspicion. His apparent eagerness to help had allowed him to stay one step ahead, manipulating the very people searching for justice. Still, the detectives knew they needed more to secure a conviction. Grant suspected there was something Lucas hadn't yet revealed, something that could finally tie him directly to the crime. All she had to do was find it before he realized the net was closing in around him. The walls were closing in around Lucas Miller, but he remained calm. Despite the growing mountain of evidence against him, he continued to deny any involvement in Emily Harper's death. He insisted that the items found in his workshop had been misplaced or picked up by accident during the search efforts. His charm, however, was beginning to wear thin, and the detectives knew they had to dig deeper to crack him open. Detective Sarah Grant could feel the tension mounting as the case neared its breaking point. Lucas had been a part of the search from the very beginning, his presence constant and reassuring to the townspeople. His involvement had made him an unlikely suspect, and for that reason, the detectives had to build their case with precision. They could not afford to make any mistakes. The breakthrough came when the forensic team analyzed the rope found near Emily's grave. It matched the type Lucas used for his work, but more importantly, the fibers also matched those found in the chest in his workshop. The DNA found on the rope fragments was finally confirmed to belong to Lucas. In a moment of intense pressure, the detectives returned to Lucas's home. hoping to find a missing link that could conclusively tie him to Emily's murder. When they entered the house, something felt off. The quiet, tidy room seemed to echo with the weight of secrets. As they searched through his belongings, one item stood out: a journal hidden beneath the floorboards in the attic. The journal contained disturbing entries, some dating back months before Emily's disappearance. The handwriting was shaky at times, but the thoughts were clear. An obsession with Emily, watching her during her runs, fantasizing about confronting her, and even planning the murder. Lucas's entries revealed a chilling pattern of escalating obsession, culminating in a day-by-day account of his actions leading up to Emily's death. As the detectives read through the pages, the horror of what they were uncovering sank in. Lucas had not only stalked Emily but had carefully planned her murder. He had watched her jog alone for weeks, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. His decision to join the search party had been premeditated, an attempt to deflect suspicion and monitor the investigation from within. The final, most damning entry described the moment he attacked Emily. It was a cold and calculated narrative of how he ambushed her on the trail, restrained her, and took her to the secluded spot in the woods where her body would be discovered. There was no remorse, only satisfaction that she had become another piece in his twisted fantasy. With this new evidence in hand, the detectives brought Lucas in for questioning. His demeanor remained unnervingly calm, even as they confronted him with the journal and the physical evidence. For a moment it seemed as though he might crack. But instead, Lucas's face hardened. He maintained that the journal was nothing more than a collection of thoughts and refused to take responsibility for Emily's death. It wasn't until the detectives presented the final piece of the puzzle, a photograph of Lucas at the search site, standing uncomfortably close to Emily's body, his boots leaving a distinct mark near the grave, that Lucas's facade began to crumble. The photo was taken by one of the volunteers who had been unaware of the incriminating moment. In the face of overwhelming evidence, Lucas's calm broke. His hands trembled as he finally confessed, not with remorse but with a chilling sense of detachment. He had killed Emily because he had grown obsessed with her, and when she started to show signs of resistance, he couldn't bear the thought of losing control. He thought he could outsmart everyone, manipulate the search, and divert suspicion long enough to escape capture. The town of Havenridge was left in shock. The man who had once been a trusted neighbor, a helpful figure in the community, had committed one of the most heinous crimes imaginable. Lucas Miller was arrested and charged with the murder of Emily Harper, and the town was forced to come to terms with the unsettling truth. The killer had been among them all along. As the case came to a close, the memory of Emily Harper lingered in the hearts of those who knew her. The betrayal of one of their own left deep scars on the community, and though justice was served, the shadows of Lucas Miller's actions would forever haunt Havenridge. Here are the names of the characters in the story.